Hallo en welkom terug by Ruhmoer, die podcast vir vars vrae in jou moedertaal. So today we're really excited to have Sara Gon with us. She's the director of the Free Speech Union of South Africa and someone who has spent years standing up for open debate and the right to say what you think, even when it is unpopular. Sara spent a decade at the Institute of Race Relations, where both Alnika and I work, so a previous colleague, where she also helped launch the Daily Friend and later became its contributing editor. And before that, she was an attorney, excuse my Afrikaans accents coming through, an attorney at Weber Wenzel. And as a fun fact, she, if I'm not mistaken, co-founded and ran the Johannesburg Philharmonic Orchestra. Sara, thank you so much for joining us. We've got a lot to get into, so I'm going to hand over straight to Alnika to kick us off with a question.
Hi, Sara. Thank you for joining us. My first question will be, and I think it's a very obvious question, but it's something I'm very interested in. So I'd like you to answer this. Do you think that the freedom of speech should be allowed at universities?
Yes. It's universities should always be able to put in place rules of engagement. In fact, largely to ensure that free speech and academic freedom, and the two are inextricably linked, are able to be enjoyed by everyone at a university, whatever their views might be. And in fact, the test for free speech and the value of free speech, ironically, is in both allowing the expression of viewpoints that you might find awful, and you may even find them hurtful or make you generally, that sort of thing makes you very angry. But it's those, I take the view that no one has the right to impose an opinion on other people. You argue your opinion and you allow other people to argue their opinion, and the essence of free speech is then for you to decide either which opinion to go for, or perhaps a mix of an opinion. It's not something that anyone should be able to debate. It should be able to, impose. It is, an opinion is by its nature very, very much a personal thing, and whether it's shared or not depends on the subject, depends on the environment, etc. But if you're going to be in an academic environment where you want to push the boundaries of discovery, of knowledge, of viewpoints that affect said discovery and knowledge, you have to allow free speech. And theoretically, universities should be the ideal environments for that expression. And I'm sure you've both had the experience where people have said things in lectures or in debates or in protests that you've really, really objected to. But the sign of whether a society is healthy and whether democracy can flourish is whether those views can be expressed and heard and then counted. That's for me, is the healthy underlying need for an expression of free speech.
I happen to agree with you. I do believe that, well, I am of the strong belief that universities are the place where new ideas come to life. And that can mean anything from scientific ideas to ideology. But I always ask myself, where do you draw the line? Because my opinion on something is very different to someone else's, and that can create conflict. So where do one draw the line on how far you can take your freedom of speech?
Yeah. My general viewpoint is I'm pretty much an absolutist in that, other than the limitations imposed by the Constitution, which are narrow in the sense that there are very specific circumstances in which in which free speech can be circumscribed. It's usually in motivating for sedition or treason, again, but importantly, and most commonly in our context as ordinary citizens, is that it does not promote or incite violence imminently. Now that's quite a stretch, because if you think of the sort of, let's take the most sort of well-known example, and that is the repeated issue of Julius Malema singing and leading the chanting of Kill the Boer, which has not achieved success in our courts to have it, well, has not recently achieved success as being found to be hate speech, but has actually in earlier judgments than the most recent ones. And it shows how that line between, how, again, the actual line between free speech and whether you've gone over the line to hate speech is a matter of opinion. And it's judicial opinion that usually tampers down the debate. But as we can see, the most recent sort of inability to get the courts to support Kill the Boer as hate speech received the biggest free speech boost it could possibly get, and that was in the Trump White House. So essentially what was a losing matter by other means, other than the traditional court processes, have ended up placing the whole debate in a very different context. And I would say, even though the Constitutional Court wrongly, I suggest, and I've written about it, has refused to give AfriForum right leave to appeal against the Supreme Court of Appeal's earlier decision, I think that was a mistake. And I think it was a mistake not because the Constitutional Court is obliged to find for AfriForum or against the EFF or anything else, but there are certainly arguments both ways. And essentially, by refusing the leave to appeal, what the Constitutional Court was saying was that it has, in fact, said as much, that it has few prospects of success. And my opinion is that legally there is a valid argument, and therefore the possibility of success means it's an open situation. It can be argued either way, and as such, it cannot be taken for granted that the court would or should find for or against either party. And I know a lot of people say that, you know, uttering the words repeatedly evince an intention to perpetuate hate. That's always possible when you allow free speech. The advantage, however, and I've put the advantage in quotes because it may not easily be seen as an advantage, is that by hearing those words spoken repeatedly, it allows members of society to take it on, to tackle it, to argue against it, and to, as AfriForum did, go to court over it if they feel that it needs to be done. So that's the problem, is that if it's circumscribed, if the right to free speech is too easily circumscribed, you actually don't know what people are thinking and what they're doing. And I certainly get an impression from surveys that have been done recently, and that certainly the IRR's surveys, even amongst members of the EFF, interestingly, they do regard it as hate speech. And I think the more people can hear and be exposed to different views, the more likely they are. And if you have a significant number of EFF members saying, you know, it's really not a good idea, then you've achieved what speech should achieve, which is a moderation of views. And moderate views, again, tend to reflect a successful democracy.
Mm. So you, I 100% agree with you in the sense that it is, where you draw the line, it comes down to who makes the decision of, I suppose, what is harm in free speech. You mentioned hate speech and free speech. Can you just give us like a quick, what is the difference? Where do you actually identify the one ends and the other starts? What
Okay.
exactly is hate speech? And how does that, like, how does hate speech enter university? Because free speech we can agree on, like, free speech is necessary in universities, but hate speech in universities, like, it's a little bit of a what's the difference between those two terms?
Well, hate speech generally there is a limitation on it in that although the Constitution provides for incitement to violence and that potential being imminent, the Equality Act, I won't go into the full title of it, but let's call it the Equality Act, which looks at issues of discrimination, defines hate speech as speech that essentially, and the Constitutional Court has upheld this now, that is harmful, or potentially harmful, or could sort of create the level of harm now that would be violent. Now the idea of harmful is not envisaged as being purely physical. It's mental. It could be anguish. It could be detrimental to your ability to I suppose essentially enjoy the rights that you should have as a citizen. Now that applies everywhere in South Africa, including but not limited to universities. Anyway, the difference with the universities is that, given the febrile atmosphere often on universities, the passionate emotions of university students about the rightness or wrongness of a cause, I think what universities should be doing is ensuring that expression of opinion and of emotion does not in any way hamper the ability of those who have an opposing view or an alternative view, or a belief in a set of facts that differ to that particular opinion as being expressed, that it does not cause students to feel that they cannot question, they cannot challenge, they may face a risk in doing so. And that's probably the most problematic. We've seen it probably the most recent example that is relevant is the Ivy League universities in America on the Palestine-Israel conflict. And it's the point at which, if Jewish students feel that their ability to enjoy the benefits of the university, to express their views, are threatened to the extent that the way in which opposing views are expressed inhibit their rights, inhibit the rights of the Jewish students, while the rights of those who oppose Israel's position are left sort of unmediated and ungoverned, then you run the risk that free speech is being inhibited. And it's not the role of universities to take, in my view, to take a position on opinions. The university's role is, in fact, probably, I know may sound strange, but is fairly neutral. What it does is what it should be doing is making sure that there are rules in place to ensure that the maximum freedom is expressed without anybody's rights being diminished by virtue of the expression of other people's opinions. So that's probably the best way I can describe it. And we've seen that probably most publicly in the case of UCT, above all other universities in South Africa. But it's about the university's role is to promote tolerance, not agreement. In other words, toleration of other people's views, of each other's views, in order to advance either a cause, research, whatever it may be. And the problem that you face with universities is that the rules required to be implemented by the authorities in order to ensure that the environment allows for free debate really took a knock in the days of the Fees Must Fall campaign statues must fall, the fall of the statues in 2015. And there, what the university failed to do, and perhaps I can use it the best example, was it wasn't about whether it supported the views of academics and students who were protesting for the falling of fees and the pulling down of statues. It was the extent to which the protests escalated into an environment of fear and threat. And it was the failure to take action, I think quite, stern action, to stop the expression through any means that could pose threats, could pose, in some cases, a real danger to others, and to show that it was not taking sides on the issue. It was only asserting its authority on behavior, not on speech, but the way it was, the manner in which it was expressed. So that, I think, is the main role of any university administration. There's an enormous amount of debate at the moment about the resolutions taken by the Council of UCT to boycott Israeli academia if there's a connection to the Israeli Defense Forces. That is the matter of court action, but it's not. What's not a matter of is the decision taken on the substance of the issue. The challenge is to the fact that the university's own rules and procedures and processes were not properly followed, and that probably is the best way of giving an example of what one means about the roles universities play as opposed to the freedoms that the academics and students of a university are entitled to hold.
Yeah, I definitely, I'm so glad that you mentioned fees must fall and roads must fall, because South Africa has very powerful student movements, and it's really been at the forefront of both expanding and constraining free speech on campuses. And I mean, we've had both those fees must fall and roads must fall over the past decade. So it's relatively new movements. But I wonder, do you think South African campuses are becoming almost like echo chambers for ideological thinking, in a sense?
Yeah.
I mean, we have quite strong EFF student bodies on campuses, and not only at UCT, but many other universities across South Africa as well. And what is the danger in ideology finding its way through that channel almost?
I have to give credit to the EFF for seizing the opportunities available to it on university campus. It's not just the ability to be a recognized body and to sit on the SRC, but it's also the fact that it's organized students who are attracted by its philosophy. And the reality is, and I don't know if it's your experience, but it was mine, even in the heady days of apartheid, which dates me considerably. Students are generally, university students, smart as they are, I'm going to say something probably that really cheeses off your audience, they're not yet completely adults. So you've got the emotion of the emotions that come with teenagehood and the early 20s, with intelligence, and also students want to kind of have fun. So you don't actually see a lot of participation in SRC elections. And that has tended to, with the political parties, very much wax and wane, as has student politics. You'll find a lot of participation in mountaineering society or choral societies, etc., but things that are not ostensibly fun, unless, the idea of having perhaps an ability to express things a little aggressively, shall we say, that has always been the problem with universities, particularly in South Africa. But I think students in general, an organization like the EFF can make inroads where other say, the DA youth or the ANC youth may not be organising as consistently and as thoroughly, but it's also up to the university to make sure that no one group is creating an atmosphere that makes the others reluctant to come on board, because the boundaries of how you express your free speech are being pushed. And the fees must fall era really saw in my view, the university administration came out on the wrong side because it wasn't tough enough. And I think there's issues of history and guilt and all sorts of things. But the reality is that university students are in a fantastic position to push boundaries. And boundaries must be pushed, provided they don't prevent other people from entering into that debate as to where the boundaries should be. I don't think it's a necessarily a feature of South African universities in the way that it is of American or British universities, because I think for many of the universities, they're not in the elite category, and I say that elite category in the sense that it has a very old history, and it's immersion in the arts and the sciences and a broad base of areas of interest and profession are long-standing. Whereas for a lot of the South African universities, you're dealing with students who are there to gain knowledge and to gain a degree in order to pursue a better life. So generally the emphasis will come on that, not on the ideological issues or the political issues or the international affairs issues or whatever they may be. Their concerns are being able to achieve the information, to obtain the information and achieve the results that will better their life opportunities. So it's very much more confined to probably as a real issue to relatively few universities in South Africa. But it's a matter that you've really got to look at your academics and your student body as there are rules, and there are rules for a purpose. And the irony is that the provision of rules is to allow the broadening of the debate.
Sarah, I have a question for you. So, it's going to come with a little bit of a story. So you mentioned a EFF member on the student council, and I remember when I was at university, it felt a little bit like I was in a bubble. There was no political influence, even though there was one class I absolutely hated. And I remember I went to Anle and I said to her, like, this is not okay. So what? Okay. Don't know where to
You must say
start.
it was an anthropology class.
Yeah, it was an anthropology class, and I hated it because. So what happened was, at that stage I was 21 or something, but I changed my degree, so I had to take first year modules again, and the anthropology class was a first year module. And I remember sitting, I never went back to the class again. Anyway, horrible student. I remember the lecturer said in the class that every white person in South Africa is born with white privilege. And I thought, that's not fucking true. because like it's not I don't, anyway, long story short, I really didn't like that statement. And I thought to myself, you're saying this to 18-year-olds or however old they are. They're very impressionable. And me being a little bit older, not fully developed brain, but having a little bit more of life experience and exposure to the outside world, I knew that that's not the entire truth.
Right.
That bothered me because of them being so impressionable. And back to the EFF being on the student council, I also don't believe that the government should have influence on universities. I truly believe that when you are at university, you should be in this bubble, and your lecturers should expose you to several ideas and not just one. So, in a sense, this lecturer, in my opinion, failed the students because he only introduced them to one opinion. And on the other hand, having a EFF member on the student council is also failing the students because they're so impressionable. So my question, I guess, is what do you think about it?
What do we do
Yeah.
about the lecturers?
Yes.
Yeah. Look, I mean, the problem is, although South Africa led the charge, so to speak, in 2015 with the Flawless movement, South African academia takes a lot of its cues, and had been for years, for decades, from Western universities, from American, from European universities, particularly from the Anglophone world. And it's actually I think one of the challenges that universities face, and that's been the subtext to a lot of the questioning of American university equivalent of vice presidents, or I think they call them presidents, about anti-Semitism on campus, is because you have an orthodox view that is not favorable to Israel in the conflict, but is manifested increasingly in anti-Semitism against Jewish students. And if you don't have that sort of balance in your academia that is would represent perhaps both positions. I don't want to specifically related to that conflict, but it is the most visible example of what I'm talking about. What you've seen is that with the encroaching sort of progressive leftism on campuses worldwide, and they what happens on a campus does not stay on a campus. It extends out. You've seen, for example, I've seen a number of reports on the extent to which, particularly in the arts, not less so in the sciences, but we've seen that here as well, where an orthodox view that I think you and I would agree would be actually, I suppose, racist and indefensible, becomes an orthodoxy, and it becomes an orthodoxy, and that the responsibility of lecturers is a real problem, or the academics is a real problem, because they have influence over students, and their expression and the failure to make sure that views are moderated by alternative views is a very powerful way of shutting down speech. And I know one of my sons was at UCT during that period, that 2015 to 2017, and he said he felt reluctant to speak up, because he knew what he felt, he knew what he thought, but he didn't have the confidence of experience to stand up and challenge it and take the risk of being ostracized because of a predominant orthodoxy. The situation is now that, as I understand, certainly in America, that there are really few. The ratio of progressive academics to conservative or centrist academics in many of the disciplines that express themselves in campus protests very readily means that the universities are failing to provide that balance that provides a broader sense of views. And of course, as you say, you're dealing with a group, not just youth, but the fact that people come from environments where may not be exposed to anything of a political or philosophical nature at all until they get to until they get to university. And university is an amazing environment for an orthodoxy to form that becomes difficult to challenge unless you've had the exposure to something other than that orthodoxy. And perhaps I'll give you what I think is a sweet example, and it pertains to the IRR. We've had many interns over the years. I think, Anu, you were once an intern. I don't think you... and being an intern meant you were both a university student while you're also doing work for the IRR. So you were getting, in that way, getting access to a variety of views. And what I found interesting, and these were mostly Cape-based interns, and I don't know if that's coincidental, but not confined to either gender, is that they would go in full of the vigor, vigorous socialists wanting to change the world, wanting to create a better world, which from the perspective of someone like me, I know cannot be achieved. You can only do your best to mitigate the bad and advance the good. That's my theory. And they go in and they first year and they'd be exposed to a whole range of ideas that supported this socialist ideal until a lecturer, and this I heard a comment from more than one or two interns, until they were exposed in economics to the works of Thomas Sowell. And it was almost like a religious conversion, because clearly the difference represented in Thomas Sowell's work to probably the most of what students were exposed to obviously resonated with something that was either working through their minds intellectually or based on their experience growing up in whichever environment they grew up in. And it's for that reason I am concerned about universities that don't ensure that broad base of both education and debate is available, because young students are a blank slate, and that's very powerful, and it doesn't necessarily portend well if you don't have the opportunity to be able to juggle those ideas and see what makes sense and see what your responses based on your own experience you think is the way in which your life should be governed and the decisions you should take. And that's the biggest argument for free speech, is every individual person has agency. And it's something that the ANC doesn't seem to be terribly fond of, is individual agency. But the reality is we all have agency, and our ability to express our own agency and the right to make our own decisions is based on our exposure to how we're brought up, where we're brought up, which religions we espouse, and the influences, particularly in the academic setting. But you have to bear in mind as well, and perhaps this is something that, again, I'm not sure your university-going viewers may agree with or not. University is an elite experience in the sense that it benefits a tiny proportion of the South African population, unlike, say, the UK or the USA, where they say, I think, almost 50% of work seekers have university educations. In South Africa, it is a privilege in the real sense for anyone of any color, from any background, to be able to access a university education. And as such, the majority of South Africa doesn't necessarily share your own concerns, but they know people develop a sense of what they need to do to get ahead in the society. And so to some extent, on the one hand, if you're grooming leaders who will have had a university education, there are risks attached to having a limited range of views. But the rest of the population, which is the majority of South Africans, base their experience, which does not include a university experience, and sometimes doesn't even include a proper schooling, and that's another issue for another day. They have agency in the same way. They determine their future, and that's where your whole debate about the state being responsible for the well-being of the people is open to question.
Yeah. Sure. Okay, so I want to share an example from my university experience as well, because I think it's quite appropriate. There's a few scenarios where I felt like I recognize a different opinion or a different view, and I grant you your ability, like you are able to express that view as long as you allow me to express my view as well. So I think I've probably told both of you the story, but at UCT, behind the economics faculty bathrooms, there behind every stall door, there's a little sticker that says "From each according to his need, to each from each according to his ability, to each according to his need." And that's a blatantly Marxist statement. And obviously, I don't hold that viewpoint myself, but I think it is very well, okay, put your sticker there, it's all good. But I think there's a big sense of responsibility on the rest of us who don't hold that view to go and print stickers to put it next to it. And I think that's perhaps an area where I want to say the opposition to many of these views, and I don't mean Marxist views, I mean if you are in opposition to a specific view being expressed, we often don't express it. And you mentioned earlier there are various reasons for that, including, as in the case with your son, perhaps you don't have enough confidence or outward experience to say, I am willing to stand up and actually say this. Even you might perhaps be willing to, but not feel confident enough to actually do so. And I certainly agree that having been able to also work at the Institute while I was still studying allowed me to also engage with people like yourself and build up that confidence to, when I go to university, be able to say and speak my mind, saying that I disagree if it is appropriate. But I think, yeah, it's hard to stand up for what you believe in and to speak your mind. And I think as a consequence of many of the perhaps sides of the spectrum who are sometimes more energetic and more revolutionary, being a little bit overbearing sometimes, it makes it even harder for you to then face that hardship and actually say what you want to say. So I wonder, why do you think we self-regulate? Because I found myself in quite a few instances where I think maybe I shouldn't say that. If I can just quickly indulge me for one more example, is my first day at UCT on the campus. I was sitting having lunch with my new student mates, whatever you call it, the ander studente. And we were talking about Afrikaans music, and it was just me and one other Stellenbosch guy, and there was a bunch of Cape Townians. So we were all speaking English, but he was playing an Afrikaans song. And we somehow ended at the point of jokes, and I said, "Oh yeah, Leon Schuster." And I was shushed. I was told, "Listen, that is not a name that we speak on this campus." And I immediately recognized, that is not entirely free speech, but I from there on kind of self-regulated myself when I were around them. Why do you think that happens, and why should we stand up against it?
I think it happens for very natural reasons, and that is that usually the people who prescribe what can and can't be said by their opinion, like we don't mention Leon Schuster's name, or if you support Israel, you support genocide, is usually the modus of of saying something is because in the way that they are, hits up against our upbringing. In other words, the natural, shall we say, politeness, not acquiescence, but we all play a role where we know, and we've been brought up to first treat people respectfully, not make assumptions about people. Of course, the whole purpose of being at university is to test all our assumptions, but not just our assumptions, everybody's assumptions. But I think one of the problems with the movement of universities towards a progressive leftism, the whole nature for me of the expression of critical race theory and diversity, equity, and inclusion is the antithesis of what it says it is. It is intended to it's intended to convey a very distinct view that, and by virtue of the absolute way in which it is expressed, to create the sense that it's not up for discussion. It just goes against our sense of this is not the way people should speak to each other. In other words, you don't in any way approach the matter where you're playing the person, not the issue, or the person rather than the ball. And essentially, if in an environment where academics, CEOs, or whatever it is, do indicate that quite emphatically that approach is unacceptable because it shuts down a discussion that should be happening. Because what you'll also find is generally people are generally in the middle. I mean, when I listen to my son talking about his friends who were very broad, who came from a very broad base of experience, there was what we call, and I believe there's a movement against it, common sense. And that has to do with being brought up not to assume that somebody is something or is not something. How they talk, what they say, and what they do, they will reveal themselves positively or negatively. But our reaction is you don't respond to threat or aggression or the shutting down of speech. That it's you don't. Your instinct is not to behave in the way that the person who has tried to essentially intimidate you and cut back on your speech should have done. It's disrespectful, and it denies that opportunity, or that obligation almost to not I won't say not allow, because but not to allow people to disallow other people from expressing their views. The example you give is I mean, one can understand why there might be views about Leon Schuster, and he's very much a reflection of a past era. But to some extent, the backlash against CRT and DEI are a reflection of the fact that there is something untenable about an ideology, a philosophy, or an approach to life that circumscribes who's acceptable and who is not. And I mean, I've always had, look, I have a problem with victim ideology anyway, in general, but you essentially here have a disconnected group of people, in other words, academia, saying who are victims and who are not victims. And the analysis that that creates that sense is both generally archaic, cliched, and shallow. If you're in a democratic society that adheres to principles of non-racism and constitutionalism as we are, then that ethos, which was very much on view from 2015, but did not originate in 2015 onwards, there is the ultimate pushback, because it's not I take the view that it's not for anyone to decide who is a victim. Victims may eventuate in a society, and what type of victims they are, to what extent they need outside help, or simply to be recognized as equals in society is what should motivate us. Victimhood, in any event, can be relying on victimhood to form as your identity, but not as a motivator to strengthen your position and to secure your position in a society, is a disaster for a society. And victims who are victims changes over time, changes with the legal system, changes with the move from the apartheid era to a constitutional democracy is exactly that example and point. And anything, to my mind, any idea that circumscribes who may be regarded as a victim and therefore who has the special social status to be protected from everyone else is pretty much repulsive. If I can just say that when that sort of ethos has been prevalent, also the sense of self-protection comes in. Is if I stand up and say something, and I'm not only not going to be supported by the lecturers in a given in a classroom situation, but I actually may attract the ire of the lecturer because they have had no compunction about holding a certain view and allowing it and only it to be promoted. The sense of whether you will be free to express another view and it will be a matter of robust and meaningful and fun debate, your protective instincts are going to kick in.
Yeah, I wanted to say
I still find that happens when I feel that I'm in an environment where my reading of a room is that nothing I say has the potential of having an impact. I tend to say it in an environment that I think it at least will be heard and thought about, if not agreed with. I think it's a natural protective mechanism. So while it shouldn't happen, kicking yourself afterwards for not having been something you weren't then.
It's not useful.
Resisted.
I definitely agree. I think it's definitely, it has that evolutionary aspect to it, where you don't want to go against your group, because then you'll get exiled. And if you think of way back when, if you get exiled, you essentially die, and it's a protective thing. And the same thing, well, a similar thing happened to me. So I studied art history, and it's a very liberal, very, very liberal degree, and I don't necessarily agree with everything. I'm essentially a very conservative art historian, if you can say that. And I enjoy gender studies because I can go, well, to some degree, I can say that it's not as people think. And I remember with my honors paper, I had an artist that claimed she was a they, them. And to me, language is also very important. You can't refer to a singular person in a specific sentence, obviously, as a plural, and it messes with your sentence structure. So, and anyway.
At the very least.
Yeah, anyway. So, long story short, in my honours paper, I took the biological aspect of male and female, and then you get this. There's a very famous philosopher in gender studies. Her name's Judith Butler. She talks about, I'm sure you know of her, but she talks about the gender performance. So I made a very clear distinction that you have sex and gender, and sex is biology, and gender is the performance. And gender is, in my opinion at least, based on your psychology. It's based on, if you want to go deep into it, you think of Jungian psychology with the masculine and the feminine archetypes. Anyway, so I explained everything. And at some point, I referred to the artist as a she. Well, I did that a lot, but eventually I had to change it because it was not correct, according to my lecturer. And she's amazing. I'm not going to, my study advisor now, she's amazing. She's great at what she does. But it did bother me because I literally explained why I'm using the correct pronouns, and now I have to go and change it. So I ended up just using her surname the whole time and not referring to her as any gender specifically or any sex specifically. But it's annoying. And I asked her, like, why is this such a issue? And it's literally like, I don't know if you remember this, but a few years ago, Harvard sent out a list saying these are the acceptable terms. You can't say, for instance, fireman. You have to say fire person. That's a stupid example, but
it's not enough, but I'll tell you why.
But they sent out this list, and in South Africa, I was at two universities, and up until now, and both of them followed that list. And it's very annoying because it's not reality. And well, to me at least. And if you tell me that I can't speak as I wish, it makes me think of the whole debacle with Jordan Peterson. He literally lost his job because he refused to change the way he speaks. And he didn't make anyone less. He didn't verkleineer someone. He didn't make them small. But he got fired because he didn't use that terminology. And I think it's ridiculous, because then where's the growth? Where's the growth if you don't allow both sides to any?
Yeah, well, I think the importance of that is, I think, rightly or wrongly, I mean, language evolves, and some languages are forever evolving. I mean, Afrikaans has achieved an enormous cultural depth through even though it's a relatively new language. English just keeps evolving because we, chuck in whatever and go with the flow, and it's very versatile. But there's one thing, I think this is not necessarily free speech related, but it literally relates to speech. The warning signs for me with the with the progressivism and was not the use of language, because language is what we use to express our ideas. It was the attempt to change language. In other words, diversity meant less diversity, in effect. Anti-racism did not mean non-racism, it meant racism, because it's about this, the whole ethos is about selecting, choosing, who met your standards or who did not meet your standards. And it's as soon as you see people changing the use of meaning, as opposed to they may create new terms for something, but to actually use existing language that is used by every speaker. So whatever your social class, whatever environment you grow up in, study in, or work in, you know that the words you use will have a certain meaning. And if you want to mean something else, you either use another word, or you may introduce a word. And as I say, English is we steal from everybody, as English speakers. So thank you for letting me speak in my mother tongue for what it's worth. But it's exactly as soon as you are trying to impose on people the usage of language in something that is not societally accepted, and accepted by, I mean, that is how it's used. There's a sign that there's a I would argue almost a fascism at play here. And I mean, if you read a lot of the sort of centrists I read or podcasts I watch, Judith Butler has effectively become a figure of fun, because her own identity is certainly her matter, and for her, if she wants to be called something that she isn't, face to face, I guess most people would do it, but you would do it knowing that the common sense doesn't apply. There is no such thing as a plural singular. Plurals are plurals because they're not singular. And that's why plurals exist and have existed through time immemorial. Look, I think I'm happy to sort of chat about whether we should speak about fireperson or fireman. I personally am one of those people. You got fireman. What a fireman should be is it should reach a point where you don't assume that it's a man, because women who can be firemen as in like in chairman. In other words, the way you use language can change its meaning. So you're not going to talk about a firewoman or a fireperson. You're going to talk about a fireman, and
think women.
Everyone knows that a fireman could be male or female.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's how language evolves. To sort of have this dogged insistence that you have to have a neutral term, I'm not sure achieves the right effect, because you then become self-conscious every time you make it use it. Look, a fireperson may become the norm, and I, for example, have no problem that when you no longer refer to actresses generally. You generally talk about an actor, and mostly people will see will not if it's referring to a female, it's as valid as referring to a male. So in that sense, you are making terminology and language more neutral. But to go through the contortions of using terminology that is not gaining acceptance beyond the hallowed halls of academia, it almost misses the point of trying to convince people that the philosophy you hold or the ideology you adhere to, that you think other people should do, it's not. You're not attracting people on their terms. You're creating a set of terms that require a membership to use.
Do you think transformation is another instance in South Africa specifically where transformation, they almost changed the meaning behind the word transformation?
Now, you see, there's a sense of a word that has been used, has been transformed, and that happens in society. It's also become, as a result, one of my least favorite words, because it doesn't. Transformation means change, and usually change for the better. It has become a cliche, a dog whistle for presenting a benevolence which it hasn't actually achieved. if you want to transform something, by all means. And that's the problem, of course, is when political elites hang on to a term like transformation, or the left, talk about according to your needs, terms like that. It's immediately trying to mask something, either mask something or achieve something that is practically unattainable. Now, there may be people who think that, my sense of what's practically attainable is elitist, unfair, but I'm not going to deny you your right to argue otherwise. But that, yes, there's no doubt language, but it's perhaps the most shallow example is to use terms like slang. Slang doesn't tend, it creates a meaning, but it doesn't last. It usually, after a number of decades or a passing of a certain period, slang changes, and it changes all the time. It may be very popular, but I was just, I mean, can you imagine saying that something's groovy? I mean, that is so 1970s, but that's how language sort of naturally evolves. But when you actually take existing settled words that appear in dictionaries, and connote them to mean something they don't, then you have to worry, because there's your threat to free speech, is they will be talking about one thing and meaning something else, while you're talking about something and not meaning what they think it means, or they purporting for it to mean. So, and I think the pretending that biological sex is somehow can be changed through discourse, through language. Science is always evolving. There's never such thing as the final answer in science. But let me put it this way. There are enough women in the world who've experienced what it's like to be a woman biologically to know that the differences between men and women do not originate with society. They are exacerbated by society, or recognized and treated with equal respect. But hell, it's taken a long time for women to get to that position. But ignoring biology, that's another red flag. You can't ignore biology. I mean, the science is too strong, shall I put it that way, to say, no, your gender identity is what's relevant, your biology is not. It's in my view, my opinion, it's not valid, because it's completely cutting out something that is a societal given, and it's a societal given based on accompanied by rigorous scientific exploration.
Sara, before I get to the very last question, I want to ask, and so do you have hope for free speech in universities in South Africa specifically? And I ask that because this podcast, in my opinion, is a way for me and Alnika to explore these type of ideas, but I suppose the hope is that somehow perhaps a younger Anlu listens to this and she goes to UCT and she sees the sticker behind the door, and tomorrow morning she will go print a sticker and put it up next to it. Is there something? Yeah, exactly. That will actually perhaps join the SRC and be the alternative voice to some of the EFF SRC members. Is there something that you can identify in South African universities and in young people that gives you hope for the future of free speech?
It does. South Africa is actually very lucky. I mean, the Free Speech Union of South Africa is allied to the other international free speech unions in the Anglophone world, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the UK. We have lots of free speech. I mean, probably the most oppressed environments are are the few universities that allow a very singular ideological approach to become dominant. But in a way, having come out of apartheid and having a constitutional right to free speech, which is really a foundational right to the expression of any other right, I think my role is to keep it alive, is to recognize it, is to call it out when it looks like somebody or some organization is trying to confine it. But in reality, we just don't have the breadth of problems that the rest of the Anglophone world is fighting. And I think it's partly because it's been a constitutional right to take away, in any meaningful sense, the broad South Africans' right to free speech. I think would create an explosion of free speech, the like of which we'd never seen. I mean, you've seen how you listen and you see how people talk and write, and sometimes dreadful things they say on social media. I think I'm inclined to agree with an older colleague who sees it as a pox and a plague, the social media, but we all use it to some or other extent. But it's being imbued with a right that was not available until the 90s. Is to take it away would be unimaginable, virtually. And I think most South Africans expect, if nothing else, they have the right to complain about the government. I mean, if you want a unifying factor, it's listening to people in all walks of life, being free to say that they are really annoyed with the government. And I think the inculcation of that right and being able to use it irrespective of class, education, etc. I think unless something very draconian happens, the universities essentially, as I guess universities often do, they will be forced to change because the outside world would find their intolerance an anathema. And at the end of the day, if free speech does nothing else, and if 30 years of a constitutional democracy has done nothing else, it has given rights to people everywhere in South Africa. So universities, and to some extent, you're seeing the pushback, either come on board and reflect the zeitgeist of the nation, or they become ossified. And of course, expressing free speech has consequences, and UCT's very much seeing consequences. You can say what you can. The university administration may say something a donor disagrees with, but a donor can say, "Okay, well, I'm really offended by that, or it's counterproductive, or whatever they may say," and they remove their donations. Speech may be free, but it's not without consequences, both what you say and how you express it. And how you express it is a big element of using free speech. It's a fantastic broad right, but you still have an obligation to use that right in the way that is most constructive to society, or the way you believe is most constructive to society. And someone can always argue against you, but that's what free speech is. It is both a right, and it imposes an obligation.
Yeah, as most important things in life do. It's both a right and a responsibility that comes with it. So as we wrap up, our previous guest always leaves a question for the next guest, and last week's conversation was about herbalism, and finding alternative nature remedies for
Western medicine,
essentially. I struggled to explain exactly what it was. It was a very interesting conversation. But so Chantal Rabi, who was on last week, would love to know, and both Annika and I would love to know, if you come across things in your life that you do not agree with in terms of free speech, what's your favorite way to check in with yourself? and to take book of how you feel about something. There's often in our lives something that I'm not entirely set on yet, that I'm not entirely sure what to decide on. How do you decide on which side of the spectrum you are? How do you check in with yourself in that way?
I think it's by basically in the areas where I think are important to hold opinions. It actually comes down to measuring what I read and what I hear against, I guess, a lifetime of experience, and whether it fits a moral and common sense need. If everything that I have gained from the information I receive, from the experiences that I have, suggests a position or a course of action that is ultimately seeks to realize the truth. I mean, I think to find the truth is a very difficult task, but essentially I look towards, has something been said that is alleged to be a fact, and everything from being informed and having experience suggests that that fact is correct or is wrong, or is not a fact. It's really largely a question of informed gut instinct, if that isn't
I
a
was waiting
contradiction
for
in
gut.
terms.
My follow-up question was, do you ever use your gut to think whether something is, it feels right in my gut?
not often enough, but it's really a question of, is what I'm thinking or believing, given sort of experience and the information out there and the views of other people, do I have have I achieved a fair conviction that the way I would like to lead my life and the views I have on things are better for society in the broad sense, rather than only for specific interest groups. And I'm old enough to say that I'm right, and I don't care whether I'm not.
Sara, where can people find out more from you?
Okay. We've got a website. We're fairly modest. We're on social media, but the website is really just a resource to read about free speech, why it's important, where it's being messed around with and shouldn't be. And so that's info. Sorry, that's my email address. It's freespeech.org.za.
Okay.
It's really that simple. I do have an occasional podcast where I specifically raise free speech aligned issues. It's called Free Speech Matters, and but they are all on the website. So any information that you may be keen to hear or listen to or get astounded by is there. And yeah, that's it. Social media is. I'm a great fan of email, but I am on X and at Speech Africa is the handle. And freespeech.org.za is both. Info at freespeech.za is email for connectivity, and Facebook is for older people, and I'm on Facebook. We're on Facebook as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sara, for talking to us today about free speech. I enjoyed it a lot, and I'm glad that there are people out there with the knowledge that have the same perspective as me. Yeah. Okay. As jy like wat jy hoor, subscribe en maak Ruhmoer.
Bye.